Thank you, Aaron. Yep, I just got it.
If you can go ahead and start the recording, that'd be great.
Just hit it.
Perfect.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me for my session on painting with PowerShell with a focus on SQL Server administration. My name is Chris Sommer. I'm a SQL Server DBA here in my hometown of Rochester, New York. Here's my contact information. Jot this down. I also have a slide at the end, so if you don't get it all now, that's fine. I've been a DBA for about 16 years. The first 8 of my career were actually spent working on Informix and Oracle databases on the Unix platform. And about 8 years ago, I had a really cool opportunity come up. And needless to say, I've been a SQL Server DBA ever since. I really enjoyed the platform. So I made the switch from the dark side to the light side. And we're here to talk a little bit about automation. And my automation and love of automation, which I actually thoroughly enjoy, began back when I was working on Unix. We didn't have the graphical interfaces that you enjoyed so much on the Windows platform. So I learned how to script at a very young DBA age. I've been scripting ever since. I was very fortunate to have been a part of a very strong team, and we really scripted everything from controlling our services to backing up and restoring databases. If we had to do any software updates, code releases, anything like that, we scripted everything. Everything was scripted. So I learned how to automate things very early on in my DBA career. And when I made the switch to SQL Server, one of the first things I did look for was a way to do some of the things that I was already familiar with. And shell scripting is one of them. And luckily, PowerShell was just coming on the scene just right about that time. So why do we automate things? I think it's pretty clear that, in my opinion, the 3 main things that we try to tackle with automation is scalability. So as our environments grow, and I don't know about yours, but mine is continuously growing, but we're not adding DBAs necessarily to handle that additional growth. And automation is one of the things that helps us deal with that. Another reason I think we automate tasks is due to complexity. So complex tasks. Computers are very good at handling complex tasks, and they do them very consistently every time as well. Computers may not necessarily do what you want them to do every time, but they definitely do what you tell them to do or program to do. And that's where automation really kind of helps us manage our ever-growing and ever-complex environments. Another thing I'd like to mention around automation in general is that I think there's different levels of automation. I think sometimes this is overlooked because if you could ask 10 different people or 10 different DBAs, even here on my own team, what does it mean to be automated? You might get 10 different answers because I think there's different levels of automation. There's the extreme on the left of a completely manual process, and we all know about that. That's pushing the buttons and doing it all yourself, to a completely automated solution where the computer is driven off of triggers or events or something like that, and there's no human interaction involved at all. What I find most often as a DBA and using PowerShell to help automate my environment is that I usually live somewhere in between those 2 extremes. I may be given a project or a task to perform, and maybe I can automate a small part of it to help me towards my end goal. So I think it's okay to live somewhere in between there too as well. Don't necessarily think that the completely automated solution is the only thing you should really be thinking about. Definitely get into PowerShell, start automating the smaller tasks, and help yourself out in the long run. So as a SQL Server DBA, what's in my toolbox when I try to automate my environment? And the first thing is pretty obvious, and that's PowerShell. That's kind of what we're here talking about today. And PowerShell is actually comprised of 2 different components. There's the command line shell, which is your interactive view into your operating system, something you type and interactively get information back from your operating system using PowerShell. But when I'm talking about automation, I'm usually talking more about the PowerShell scripting language. It gives you all the same functionality that you get with your command line shell, but you can save it into a script, something that can be reused and run again in the future. And that's where I think automation kind of fits in. And the second part of my toolbox as a SQL Server DBA is the SQL PS module, which is Microsoft SQL Server module for PowerShell. And there's actually 3 different components in that. The first that I'm going to mention is the SQL Provider. And the SQL Provider is really just an Explorer-like interface into your SQL Server. And by interface, I don't mean a GUI. I mean a programmatic interface. if you were to open up the SQL provider in a PowerShell command prompt, you could kind of walk your SQL server kind of like you walk a directory structure in your command prompt. The second thing you get with the SQL PS module are your commandlets. And commandlets are really just functions. They provide some sort of functionality for interacting with SQL Server. And forgive me, I tend to use commandlets and functions kind of interchangeably as a term. But Microsoft's preferred term is commandlets. A couple of familiar commandlets you might recognize just by name. The first one is invoke SQL command, and that is the PowerShell replacement for your Windows, your old SQL command.exe that you used to run from the command prompt. There are commandlets for backing up and restoring your SQL databases. With SQL Server 2012, they introduced a whole bunch of commandlets for managing availability groups, which actually are pretty nice. And the last thing we get with their SQL PS module are the SQL management objects, and as you might expect, they allow you to manage your SQL Server. They allow you to manage everything from your SQL Services. They allow you to manage your SQL Server and the configurations that go along with that. You can manage your SQL agent and SQL agent jobs. You can manage SQL databases and objects inside them with SMO. SMO is probably my favorite component of SQL PS and probably the most powerful. Unfortunately, it's probably one of the most difficult to use if you're not really familiar with it. And thankfully, as Aaron mentioned earlier, we finally got Microsoft to listen. So when I'm writing scripts with PowerShell, I like to call commandlets or functions to do all of my work. So what's happened in the past is I've always built commandlets to wrap around my SMO calls and kind of rolled my own solutions. And what happened is a lot of people started doing that. So now we have a whole bunch of different code bases out there. But Microsoft is finally listening. They're starting to build some enhancements into SQL PS, so definitely keep your eye out for SQL PS. I see a lot of good things happening and a lot of really good enhancements coming down the road. And that's really all the talking I have. My presentation is very demo heavy. And what I want to kind of do is give you kind of a taste of all the different things we can do with PowerShell for helping you manage your SQL Server. I'm going to talk a little bit about managing your SQL Services. I'm going to show you how we can configure your SQL Server. Same with SQL Agent and SQL Agent Jobs. I have a neat little demo that will show you how to deploy SSRS reports using PowerShell, something you may or may not know about. I know when I first found those commandlets, I didn't know anything about them. And then finally, the largest demo I have is about migrating SQL Server databases, and all automated, all through PowerShell. So I am going to jump right into my demos. And please stop me or submit questions if you have them into the question panel. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me, Aaron. So the first thing, I actually kind of left this up. So I have all these demos set up. I have 2 different SQL Server instances on my local machine here. I have an SSRS instance running. And this is pretty much the most basic form of automation I could do. I just run this script, and it initializes all of my demos. It opens all the programs I need just to give this presentation today. So I just kind of left it up there and forgot about it, so I figured I'd show you. But the first thing we're going to show you is about managing our SQL services. And if you look at the top of my demo script, and you're going to see this throughout all the demos, I'm actually loading a custom module. And then it will also dump out all the commandlets that are included in that module. And this is kind of the way I like to write pretty much all of my scripts. Rather than clutter up my main script with a whole bunch of functions and commandlets and stuff like that, I like to put them all into a custom module. It kind of just keeps my main script clean, a little more easier to read, I think. And you'll see in this module, which is called SQL Service Management, there's actually 5 different functions in here. One for getting the disk space, getting SQL Services, setting SQL Service Start Mode, and then commandlets for starting and stopping your SQL Services. So this kind of came out, this whole the SQL Service Management came out because we had to do some patching here at my company, not long after I had started. And to patch a SQL Server, you have to log into it. Yep.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you bump your resolution up just one size? I think that would help people.
I don't know. Let me see if I can or not.
Lower right-hand corner should be, just slide that bar just one to the right.
Oh, you mean in the
ISE,
PowerShell one?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Probably just one. There you go. It's coming
a little better?
A lot cleaner now.
Sorry, guys.
All right. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I'm working on an older laptop. Its screen resolution is not that huge. I apologize. So anyway, the problem we were trying to solve, which kind of spawned this whole demo in the process, was we had to patch up our SQL servers for one of our application environments. And we had to, basically, we had a disk-based replication. We had an active primary, and we had a passive secondary server with disk-based replication. So that means that SQL Server could only be active on one side. So this whole patching process involved us failing over from our primary to the secondary, so we could patch the secondary, then failing back to the primary. So it's quite a bit of RDPs in starting and stopping your SQL servers and checking for disk to be available on both sides. And if we only had one or two pairs of servers to do that for, that would have been fine. But at the time we were talking about 50 SQL servers I had to do this to. And of course, you don't get big time windows, so we want to kind of optimize our time window. So we came up with a different process using PowerShell to manage our SQL services. I will go into the module a little bit. So this is the actual contents of the SQL Service Management module that I wrote. And the first function is called Get SQL Services. It accepts a computer name, and I'll explain that briefly. But basically, this line 14 loads our SMO module, or SMO library, I should say. We create a new instance of an object for that computer name, and it returns all the SQL services on whatever computer name that was. Now the cool thing about that is when I pass in a computer name, I can now centrally manage this whole process for failing over our SQL servers. And that goes throughout all of the different commandlets down below. So here's the commandlet for starting our SQL services. Once again, we're loading the SQL WMI management library, creating an instance and an object for that. And then there's 3 different commands here, you'll notice, because we have to start SQL Server in order or it complains. So we start the SQL Server engine, we start the SQL Server agent, and then I start all the other SQL services. And once again, this is all using SMO. I have another function here where we stop the SQL services, once again using SMO. Stopping SQL services is a little bit easier because you can use the force parameter on your stop service commandlet. And the other thing I'm going to show you a little bit is that we can set the SQL Server, the service start modes. So setting them to auto start, or setting them to manual, or setting them to disable the commandlet that does that. All of these things were kind of involved in the process of patching our SQL servers. And like I said, if it had been 1 or 2 servers, it wouldn't have been a big deal to do it all manually. We were talking about 50 pairs of servers or 100 servers. So let me go back out to my main demo script. And if I run this commandlet on line 12 there, you'll notice that it gets all my SQL services that are on my local machine. You'll notice I have 2 different instances, an instance 1 and instance 2. Instance 1 is up and running. Instance 2 is currently disabled. So now to simulate the failover process that we were kind of going through when we were doing our patching, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop the SQL services, which should stop all of my SQL services and then display that they're all stopped. At this point, what we would do, we would disable the services on the primary. So using PowerShell, instead of going into the SQL Server Configuration Manager or even the Service Manager and setting my services to disabled, I can do that using PowerShell and SMO, and you can see all my services are now disabled. At this point in our failover, we would fail over the disk from our primary to our secondary server. And a cool little commandlet that I use actually quite a bit is this get disk space commandlet, and it's posted out on my blog because it allows me to read the disk space for any server, and I can do it totally remotely. Now I will enable the SQL services on my secondary, or in this case instance 2, and dump that out to the screen. And now you can see that instance 2 is now enabled. I run the start services on my local machine again, and it should start instance 2 for us. And now we show instance 2 is now running. So that's just kind of a simulation of the failover process we had for patching a SQL Server. But more than that, I just wanted to show you this is something you can do with PowerShell. The cool thing is I didn't have to remote desktop into any of these SQL servers to do all this whole patching process, which was quite an intensive couple of days for us. So I'm just going to run this little last snippet. This is going to kind of reset my demo for me so I can move on to the next thing I want to show you, which is configuring our SQL Server. So I had received an email from my boss, and it was not long after I had started, and he had noticed some of the max and min memory settings on our SQL servers were not configured per our standards. And what the ask was at the time, he wanted me to go ahead and audit our environment and then true it up, figure out what we wanted to set them to, what was not in compliance, and then to true it all up. And if, once again, I had 5 or 6 servers to do this on, it wouldn't have been a big deal. But we were talking hundreds of SQL servers that I had to audit this against. So I was like, well, how can I use a different tool to do the same thing? And once again, I reached for one of my favorite tools, which is PowerShell. So let me open up my SQL configuration. That other script is still running over there. I'm not sure exactly why it's running so long. Anyway, so as soon as that finishes, I'll be able to go ahead and load the module. Once again, I have the module written just for that purpose, for encapsulating all the functionality that goes along with running this little demo here. Let me walk you through that actual module. Okay, there it stopped. Let me load our module. And you'll notice there's only 2 different functions in this actual module. There's a get SQL Server memory config and a set SQL Server memory config. Once again, I'm using SMO, and this is a different library. You'll notice this is the Microsoft.SQLServer.SMO library. I create a new object, and then in the get SQL Server memory config, all I want to do here is return the physical memory value, the max memory, and the min SQL Server memory that are currently configured for my SQL Server. And that's exactly what it does here. So it returns those object properties for me. The set SQL Server memory config is only slightly more complex. There's a little additional logic in here, so you can pass in additional parameters. You can pass in the max SQL memory, you can pass in the min SQL memory, and I also have a little safety flag in here, commit changes. If you leave that set to default, it won't actually commit the changes that you're passing into it, but it'll show you what it's going to do. Once again, it uses SMO. It creates a new SQL Server object. If you don't pass in a max SQL Server memory, this commandlet is going to basically set your max SQL memory to 90% of your physical memory. And if you don't pass in a min SQL Server memory, it's going to set your min SQL memory to half of your max SQL Server memory, whatever that happens to be. I have some verbose output in here to see what this commandlet's going to do if I run it with a verbose parameter. And then right here, this call, line 75 and 76, is where I actually set the config values to what I want my max and min SQL memories to be. And it isn't until I run the configuration.alter method that actually gets written to SQL Server and those configurations take effect. So let's go back and look at the memory. So I have two instances on here on this machine. I have an instance 1 and an instance 2, and those are my SQL servers, and I'm going to iterate through both of those SQL servers and get the SQL Server memory config for them and see what it's currently set at. And sure enough, I have 3 gig of memory in this machine. My max SQL memory is set to 384, and my min is 192, which is half of that. So that's the current memory configuration values that I have in this server. Let's go ahead and change my memory configuration to a max of 256, which based on the commandlet that we saw should set the min SQL memory to half of that. Now you'll notice that my set SQL Server memory config didn't output anything. That's kind of by design. I don't want it to output anything unless I pass it the verbose commandlet. I have the get SQL memory config if I want to see what the values are. And if I pull it again, you'll notice that my max and min SQL memory values were changed to what I would expect them to be. And I'll pause briefly while I get into my next demo, which is configuring SQL Server agent jobs. And let me close all these ones out. Any questions so far? All right, I'll take that as a no. So the same thing that I just did with the SQL Server and SQL Server configurations, I can also do with SQL Server agent jobs in each of the job steps. So there's a couple different things that we had happen with SQL agent jobs. The first one was the job owner. So what happens when a DBA leaves the company and they own SQL Servers? Well, they all start to fail. Well, we found out the hard way. And of course, what do we have to do at that point? We have to go out and audit all of our environments. What other jobs does this DBA own? So I wrote 2 commandlets just for those purposes. The first one is the get SQL agent job owner, and this is the module once again. So this contains all the functions and commandlets for my demo. Once again, I'm using the Microsoft SQL Server SMO object library. I'm just happen to be a different property. I'm returning the job server.jobs and only a couple of different column names because those are the only column names I really want to see. And the set SQL agent job owner, you'll notice it accepts a different parameter, a second parameter I should say, called owner name, which happens to default to SA. So by default, if you don't pass it an owner, it's going to set all your jobs to be owned by SA. And there's only a little bit more to this one. I also load SMO, I enumerate all the jobs, and then I walk through every single job and I set the owner name to whatever parameter was passed in. And then I run the alter method again, and that'll set my SQL job owners. So let me set my SQL servers here to both of my local instances. Now let's see what I have for job owners. That just went out to both of my SQL servers using SMO and got all my job owners. And you can see they're mostly owned by this guy named CJ Sommer on the local machine, which just so happens to be me, but I also have a couple owned by SA. So there's some inconsistency here. And what we had found, and then we used this to discover, the DBA who left the company, they own quite a few jobs, so we had to fix them all. So what I will do, just to prove that this does what I think it does, or says it does, let's go ahead and set all my SQL agent job owners on all my SQL servers to SA. Once again, it doesn't output anything, but I have my get commandlet right here. And now all my jobs, you'll notice, are owned by SA, which is what I would expect. I do have a couple more commandlets for a couple different things with SQL agent jobs that we can look at. The next one is, I want to look at the job completion action. So job completion action, which is down here, was an interesting one for us. We use SCOM to monitor our SQL servers and our SQL Server agent jobs. Well, in a SQL Server agent job, and I'm just going to go into one to show you where this lies. This option here, the write to the Windows application event log when the job fails, if that isn't set, SCOM doesn't pick up the job failure in our environment. So what we had happening was that jobs were failing, but this was not set properly, so we were getting job failure notifications from SCOM. Thankfully, it didn't hit any really important jobs in our production environment. It was mostly across some of our implementation and dev systems, but still, it's nice to get notifications when your jobs fail. I don't know, backups are kind of important, things like that. So what we had to do is go ahead and audit our environment, and that was the exact purpose of this set of commandlets as well. So we wanted to get the SQL agent job completion action, and then I have a matching commandlet to set the job completion action, which is very much like the first commandlet, which sets the SQL agent job owner. It's just a different property that we're manipulating inside SMO. So if I get my job completion action for all my local jobs, you can see that I have a couple. Most of them are set to write to the event log on failure, but we have a couple down here that are not. So they'll never throw a notification to our SCOM system. So what I had to do was reconcile that, and we're going to set our completion action to on failure for all of my SQL agent jobs. And that runs for just a second. And once again, we can look and see that the changes indeed did take effect, and all of my jobs are now set to write on failure to the Windows event log. And the last one I have is for getting and setting the job output file location. I always like to write to a log file on my SQL Server. I don't like to rely on MSDB for capturing all my job step output. I like to have the output on a file system just in case something was to happen to my database server. So we tend to set that here for all of our SQL servers. And if you look on mine right now, this just went on and probed every single job and every single job step and looked and sees where the output file is set to. And you'll notice a bunch of the different ones are set to the same temp output.txt, which could get confusing. So if you have jobs that are writing to the same text file, they're probably going to overwrite each other. The information is not going to look very clear. So we needed a good way to reconcile that here at my job, and I came up with these two commandlets to do just that. So line 50, I'm going to set the output file location for instance 1 to this location here. And below it, instance 2 is going to go to its custom location. And just briefly, let me go to the commandlet that does that, which is down a little bit below. Or is it above? There it is. So the actual step output file name is derived from the actual job name, which we get from SMO. And then it uses a whole bunch of SQL agent variables to attend the step ID or the step number and the date time. So every single job step will have a unique file name going forward after I set them. So let me reset those two job output steps right here. And that should have just fixed all my erroneous job output locations. And sure enough, it did. So now all my SQL agent jobs are going to the right location. So next up, I have a little demo for deploying SSRS reports. And if you're all in the same room with me, I would ask how many of you had experience deploying SSRS reports. But I'm going to guess quite a few of you. And if you've done it before, here, let me delete these because we don't want those there anymore. So for those of you who haven't ever deployed an SSRS report, let me go. I'll show you exactly how it happens. And we're going to do it manually through the browser. So the first thing you have to do is select the file to upload, which is an RDL file. So you select your RDL file, you give it a name, you can tell it to overwrite if it exists. Click OK, and now it's uploading that report into SSRS, my local system. So if I click on the employee email report, it should give me, oh wait, I forgot, it's an error. I forgot to set the data source. Okay, that was a setup. I knew that was going to happen. So the second thing you do when you upload a new report to your SSRS server, you have to set the data source. So we have to go into the Manage screen of that report under Data Sources. And let me select my local data source. And then hit Apply down at the bottom. All right, and that should be set, so now our report should work. So it's really not all terribly painful, but it would take me about a minute to do that. Well, I got an email one day, hey Chris, I need you to take care of the release tonight, and that includes a whole bunch of SSRS reports. Or it includes some SSRS reports. I think the terminology was some SSRS reports. So if I go into some SSRS reports, there it is right here. My manager meant 50 SSRS reports. So it took me, what, a minute to do that, a minute to upload and set the data source for a single report file. The last thing I want to do is do that 50 times in a row during a release under time constraints. So what I came up with was a PowerShell script for that. The script's only going to load the module for us, and it's going to show you what's in that module. There's two functions in that module, one called install SSRS RDL and one called set SSRS data source, and they do just that. The install actually does the upload of the RDL file or the report to my SSRS server. The set the SSRS data source actually goes in and does the setting of that data source, so I don't have to do that manually. Now, I do want to give credit where credit is due here. The install SSRS RDL function or commandlet I found from this guy right here. He had posted it out on Stack Exchange because at the time I didn't even know that was possible. And I will say that pretty much about everything. There's a good chance that if you're trying to do something and you're trying to automate something, there's a good chance somebody's already done it. So don't be afraid to Google for things because there's a lot of really cool stuff out there. I wouldn't have found this if I hadn't turned to Google for this. And it saved me a heck of a lot of work. The set SSRS data source was referenced, I think, in this Stack Exchange post. And here's the link to the Stack as well. So once I do post these demos, you'll have all that there too. I'm not going to go into the depths of these commandlets, but I will show you them briefly. They're basically all using the SOAP interface that comes with SSRS for uploading and setting data sources. And PowerShell puts a nice little wrapper around that. So this script called deploy SSRS reports contains the web service URL, which is the URL to my SOAP interface for my SSRS server, the report folder, which is AdventureWorks 2012, which I'll show you once we get into the SSRS interface again, data source path, data source name, and then a staging location. So this is the location that all of my reports sit in on my local machine. And what the script is going to do is iterate through that report folder for every single RDL file it finds and upload that report to my SSRS server. It's going to set the data source properly, and when it's all said and done, I should have a whole pile of all those reports in this folder up in my SSRS server. Now, just for time's sake, I only told it to do the first 10, so it's only going to do 1 through 10. But let's kick it off, and let's see what it does. So now you'll notice it's kind of iterating through employee emails 01 there. It just set the data source for it, and it's moved on to report number 2. And if I go ahead and refresh my SSRS window here, we should see all these reports start to pop in. And if I click on any of them, just to test that the data source was set, it should come up and give me employee emails, which it does. For the purpose of the test, this is all a very simple report. It selects are from employee emails tail and AdventureWorks. But you could do this with any report that you have going. As a matter of fact, this very solution has been in effect here for a little over 2 years. We deploy approximately 80 or I think 85 reports on a weekly basis to multiple environments. So this has been a very successful solution for us here. And I thought that was a cool thing to share. So something I wasn't familiar with, it has nothing to do, no SMO in here at all. SOAP, which is a really cool interface, and there's a whole lot more you can do with a SOAP interface in SSRS. But something you can do with PowerShell to help make your lives a lot easier. I don't know about you, but that's a lot more friendly than manually uploading 50 reports. These 10 reports took less than a minute to get up there and configured properly. So that's what I have for that demo. So the final demo I have is on SQL mirroring. Make sure I get the right folder. And this needs a little bit of explanation. So the demo is migrating a database using SQL mirroring. SQL mirroring is probably one of the my favorite ways to actually do a database migration. It allows you to migrate between different versions of SQL Server, which is exactly the problem we had at hand. So we had a project, a fairly large project. We were on SQL Server 2005 at the time, and we had to upgrade everything to SQL 2012. So we were kind of leapfrogging over 2008s. And using mirroring is a great way to do that. And once again, if I only had 1 or 2 databases to do that with, I probably would have done it manually. I probably would have created the mirror and all that kind of stuff manually. We had to do this across 30,000 databases in a limited amount of time. I think the NTLA, it took us, I think, a little over 2 months to do this across 30,000 databases with very little impact to our end user, and the solution was completely automated. It was push button. SQL Server picked up from a queue table, and it migrated database after database after database 30,000 times. We were very successful with the solution. So this is the overall migration process we used. We would create the SQL Server mirror. We would fail it over to the new server, which is 2012, and then we would go back to the old server. We would remove the mirror and drop the original database. So that was the overall process. Now, creating a SQL mirror, although it's not really that difficult, and if you do it through the GUI, it really doesn't feel that difficult, but there's a lot of information being collected behind the scenes. Mirroring ports, backup locations, and default file and log locations, all those things kind of have to be accounted for when you try to automate a solution like this. So this is the create the SQL mirror process, and I'll show you the commandlet in a second. We would take a full backup. We'd take the transaction log backup. We would restore both of those on the new server that we were going to, restore all the logs with no recovery, and configure our mirror. And at the end of that process, we would have a configured SQL mirror. And then we'd go back and do the rest of it. So I think we're at 12:46 now. Let me just jump right into the demos for this. Once again, I have a module, a custom module, that wraps around all the functionality of navigating this process. And you notice there's a whole lot of commandlets in here. There's, I think, 12. We're actually only interfacing from the demo perspective with 4 of them. We're interfacing with the create SQL mirror, failover mirror, remove the mirror, and then drop the SQL database. But there's a whole lot of other commandlets here that are used by the create SQL mirror and the other commandlets to do their job. Yeah, and you'll notice in the create SQL mirror, it gets SQL host information where it gets the IPs and names and it translates those for us so we can use them later. It gets the default SQL Server location, so this is your default file and log location, so it knows how to remap when you're moving from one database server to another. If the directory structures aren't the same, it needs to know where to put those things, so it kind of gets those dynamically here. The working dir, this is where the backups are stored when we take backups and restore backups for creating that mirror. It gets the endpoints dynamically from both the primary and the mirror. Because both of my instances that I'm using for this demo on my local server, I couldn't just use 5022 for both. This will get that information dynamically. And then here's the actual work that happens behind the scenes, where we do our backup of the full backup. Here's where we do our log backup. Get relocate file array. This is basically a commandlet that was created that generates all the with moves commands you might think of with a restore operation, with a restore database operation in T-SQL. This generates that using SMO objects in PowerShell, so we can use them for the restores. Here we do the restores of the SQL databases. And here's where we actually create the mirror on the primary and create the mirror on the principal. And that's the whole create mirror commandlet. Failing over a mirror is pretty straightforward. And just to save a little bit of time, let's just run into the demo. Let me make sure my SQL services are all up, just as a sanity check for myself more than anything. And all my SQL servers are up. And we are going to be creating a mirror and failing it over the AdventureWorks 2012 database, which right now lives on instance 1. Let me make a connection to instance 2 so I can show you this. Oh, it's sitting in the restoring state. It's probably not going to like that very much. Let me get rid of that database quick. Let's go ahead and create a mirror. Oh, I forgot to turn on off the status. I'll do that in a second. I usually set this progress preference to silently continue so it doesn't give us those weird statuses. But you can see here that it went ahead, it did all the backup operations. It backed up the database, it backed up the log, did the restore the database, it restored the log. And now if it is not lying to me, we should now have a mirror between instance 1 and instance 2 of our AdventureWorks 2012 database. The next thing in this is kind of a semi-manual demo. Let's go ahead and fail it over from instance 1 to instance 2. The failover took me all of 1 second. So now, instance 2 should now be our primary, or principal, and sure enough it is. I'm going to go ahead and fail that back. So now it should be primary over here again. The mirror over there. I'm going to remove the mirror. So now our database should no longer be mirrored, and that's probably why I probably just forgot to clean up after my last demo. And then I can drop my SQL Server database from instance 1. That's a good idea, right? Now if you're looking at a commandlet, and actually we can really quick, so drop SQL database commandlet. Because right now it's trying to drop it off of instance 1, and that's my primary and the only copy of my database, so I don't want to do that. So what I did is I did put a check in there to make sure that my database is not mirrored and it's in the restoring state. So my database is not in the restoring state on instance 1 because it's live and active over there. This is just a little safety check, and this is the type of thing you can build in to some of your automation processes to make them a little more robust. And unfortunately, this is going to wait for about 60 seconds until it's done, which should be actually shortly, and that should fail on us. And then I'll fix my demo and drop it from the correct side.
And Chris, you've got several questions in the queue already. If you want to.
Oh, I do? Okay. I'll tell you what, let me stop that because I just want to show you one last demo, and then I'll get on to questions while this thing's working. So basically what this script is going to do is going to fail over, or yes, it's going to fail over every single database from instance 1 and move it over to instance 2. And it's going to do that for all of the mirror demo databases that are on instance 1. So the filter I actually have a T-SQL that's going to get all the database names that begin with mirror demo. So let me just run this and I'll go take a peek at my question queue and we can watch this while it's running. Let's see if I can remember how to get this out. I do not have links to the scripts yet. Aaron, is there somewhere we normally put them? I mean, I can put them up on my blog.
Yeah.
Or is there somewhere on this on a past site?
Yep, that'll work. And if you want to email them to me, we can put them. We have a OneDrive for all the scripts from all the previous presentations, and we can put it in there so that people can get to it.
That would be awesome. So that'll answer a couple of these questions, I think. What is the best way to learn what tasks or properties are available through SMO? I contemplating going into that a little bit here, but I know I was going to run out of time pretty quickly. The best thing about PowerShell, in my opinion, it's a very discoverable language. Your favorite commandlets should be get help, get command, and get member. So if you were to create an instance of an SMO object and pipe that to get member, it'll show you all the properties and methods that are in SMO. Another way to figure out what SMO capabilities are there from properties and methods and that type of thing is on MSDN. So if you were to Google, let me find right here. At the top of all of my scripts there is the, yeah, of course I picked the one that's probably not a great example. Bear with me for 1 second. So if you were to Google Microsoft SQL Server.smo, you would come up with an MSDN link that will contain links and a lot of information about all the methods and properties that come with that SMO object. MSDN is probably your best resource for that. All right, my script is done, and if all went well, which it kind of looks like it did, it scrolled by pretty quickly. If all went well, all of my databases should be gone off of instance 1, and they should now be on instance 2. So we just failed over 10 databases, and I didn't have to do a thing. And in this case, it's kind of straightforward. I'm going from 2012 to 2012. I think mirroring is probably one of the coolest migration paths to use for SQL Server, until, of course, 2016 and the new features of, if you're using availability groups, to use cross-cluster migrations maybe in the future. But mirroring is one of the, it's tried and true, it's tested, it's supported by Microsoft. It's a great way to do that. So the next question in my bin here is, do you know, is it possible to deploy SSIS packages using PowerShell? And yes, we do. We do that for one of our applications. So we use SQL Server data tools for all of our DML and DDL. We use a custom solution. So the cool thing about SSIS is that it's usually just, we used file-based. We use an SIS package that sits in a file system somewhere. So we have a script that disables any jobs that are associated with that package. It uploads a new version of the package, re-enables a job, and off it goes. So we've been very successful with doing SSIS as well. Hopefully that answers that question. The next question, in what order do we have to run the scripts? So each demo is kind of compartmentalized to itself, meaning you can run like the SQL agent scripts, just kind of top to bottom. All the modules extract and keep all the functions and commandlets away from the main demo scripts. So any of the scripts that say demo in the title, those are the ones you're going to actually want to play with and run. Now the details and the guts and the fun stuff is actually all in the modules and all the functions that I wrote. But you can take and run the demo scripts in pretty much any order if you just wanted to pick out and run, SQL agent jobs and that type of thing. One thing to note there, though, a lot of the demos are hard-coded for the instances on my local machine, so you might have to find a SQL Server you can play with, hopefully on your local machine. Just don't do it in production, please. I don't want anything to do with that. Yes, the scripts will all be available for download. Yes, the extension PS1. So the question is the extension PSM1 a naming convention I use, or is it required? PSM1 is the file extension for a script-based module. That's the Microsoft thing. That's kind of their standard. PS1 is going to be a PowerShell script. You'll notice I can't actually run a PSM1 script. So if I pull this PSM1, I mean the ISC doesn't even let me run it as a script because it's meant to be a script-based module. Can you run DML and DDL type of queries on multiple remote SQL servers? Yes, you can. I didn't show running queries as part of these demos today, but yes, you can totally run DML and DDL type queries. The first place to look and the simplest to get involved with is invoke-SQL command commandlet that lets you run T-SQL. It's pretty much the replacement for SQL command. There are some limitations with that commandlet. You can't do parameterized queries and a couple other gotchas to know about, but it's a good place to start. How are you querying SQL Server instance names? I only seem to be able to find my default instances via PowerShell. So you kind of have to know a SQL Server name that you're connecting to for instantiating an SMO object. But you can query using the WMI commandlet. I think you can get all your, so if you look at the Get SQL Services commandlet, if you download the demos, that'll be your best option for getting it through SMO. So I know it is 1 o'clock.
Oh yeah, I'm glad you're pointing that out. There is a way to do that with SMO. Basically, it's about equivalent to searching for SQL servers like when you're in SQL Management Studio. But as you mentioned, it's actually better or more reliable to search using the WMI commandlet that will allow you to inspect the EXE.
Yep.
Chris, thank you so much. I had no idea that your session was going to be so relevant today, given that we just learned in the wee hours of the morning that Get SQL Agent job was going to become a reality here soon. So thank you so much for that. I will pester the SQL team to go ahead and have a look at your demos here. And if you've got some ideas, or for those of you in the audience, if you like what you saw with Chris's scripts and you'd like to see that as part of the product, please go to that bit.ly/GetSQLAgent that I put in the comments and in the emails and everything, and upvote that and comment on it and tell them what all you want. They're listening and they want our input. Again, Chris, thanks so much for doing this. It's a great demo, and I can't wait to get it out there on the YouTube channel and let everyone have a look at it.
Awesome, thank you, Aaron. I know it was a bit of a fire hose. I'm hoping beginners and intermediate users all found it useful.
I think
my blog site is cjsommer.com.
Yep, I think there's stuff in there for everyone. Yep.
Awesome.
Great. And if you'll email me those scripts and and include a link to your blog, and I will make sure that goes out in the email to everyone that attended the webinar.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
All right. Have a great day.
You too.